Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Last week, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced the UK's intention to recognize Palestinian statehood in September. With this potential change, what are the implications for British foreign policy, UK-Israel relations, and the British Jewish community? Joining us today to unpack these questions is Phil Rosenberg, President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Moderating our conversation today is AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson. After we hear from Phil and Jason, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason, the floor is yours.
Claire, thank you very much. As Claire was just saying, Britain's Middle East policy has been very much in the news in recent days. Last week, Prime Minister Starmer declared that Great Britain would recognize a Palestinian state next month, likely on the eve of the UN General Assembly session, unless Israel met a series of conditions related to its actions in Gaza. And then over the weekend, Foreign Secretary Lami, reacting to the horrific videos that were just circulated by Hamas of two emaciated Israeli hostages, reiterated the United Kingdom's insistence that all hostages be released, that Hamas be disarmed, and also that humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza be unimpeded. It's the Prime Minister's July 29th statement that I want to especially focus on in today's conversation with Phil Rosenberg, President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, an organization with which AJC has had the privilege of working and collaborating for decades. Phil, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by quoting a key passage of that statement of July 29th from the Prime Minister. Quote, "We are determined to protect the viability of the two-state solution, and so we will recognize the state of Palestine in September before UNGA. Unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza and commits to a long-term sustainable peace, including through allowing the UN to restart without delay the supply of humanitarian support to the people of Gaza to end starvation, agreeing to a ceasefire, and making clear there will be no annexations in the West Bank. We will make," continuing the quote, "we will make an assessment ahead of UNGA on how far the parties have met how far the parties have met these steps. No one side will have a veto on recognition through their actions or inactions." That's the quote from the Prime Minister of last week. Phil, first of all, thanks for joining the AJC Advocacy Anywhere conversation. Please give us your take on that statement, and in particular, its placement of all the conditions for British recognition of Palestinian statehood exclusively on Israel. I couldn't help noticing that although the Prime Minister included in his statement no conditions that Palestinian leadership or even Hamas would have to meet, he nevertheless concluded the passage I just quoted by saying that Britain would judge, quote, "how far the parties have met these steps," although it was just one party that he cited. What's your sense?
Well, thank you for having me on. It's great to be back with the AJC, and I really enjoy our partnership. It's one of the most important in the world to us, so thank you for having me on today. The statement itself was confusing and counterproductive in our view. It did include a series of demands of Hamas, but conditions only on Israel, as you said, Jason. And this creates, in our view, completely the wrong incentive structure. Because at the moment, and we are very, very angry about this, if Hamas is the one blocking a ceasefire agreement, and say Israel agrees to, and they have been agreeing to in recent weeks, and Hamas has been refusing, and if they continue to hold the hostages, the UK may well still recognize a state of Palestine, effectively rewarding terrorism, rewarding hostage taking, and disincentivizing coming to a ceasefire arrangement. Now, that is all in contradiction of the UK's stated foreign policy aims. And so we find it hard to understand why it is, or why the government thinks that this is a good idea to proceed in this way.
And of course, the Prime Minister talked several times in the course of his statement about there Britain is still committed to achieving a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and yet he didn't seem to. He seems ready to accept a Palestinian state given birth without negotiations. I don't quite understand his thinking.
Well, I think the UK government understands that recognition doesn't lead to a state in fact. It's trying to put a finger on the dial and trying to move that forward, trying to create pressure on Israel to meet the various conditions. There's a lot of frustration in the UK and in other places about how Israeli governments in recent years, and particularly now in the context of this horrible war, have stepped away from the two-state solution, which is, in the view of the UK government, the only viable solution forward. And therefore, they feel that there's an urgent need to push this forward. It should be said that until a few days before this announcement, the government was resisting quite hard calls to go exactly down this path. In the days previously, they'd made a definitive statement, or we thought it was definitive, that they wouldn't be pursuing recognition at this time. But it has to be said that the scenes from Gaza, particularly of the humanitarian crisis that's going on there, and popular pressure, and including party political pressure within the Labour Party, forced a rethink, and they've come up with what was in the end quite a botched statement. If you looked at it, there were colons where there were clearly supposed to be other things following it, and things have been copied and pasted and removed, and the statement had come out maybe not in as clean a form as they might have hoped. And certainly this incentive structure is very strange and actually counterproductive and counter to the UK's objectives.
Phil, talk about the sort of political divisions within Great Britain on support for Israel. There is, of course, a Labour Friends of Israel organization. There's a Conservative Friends of Israel organization. There has been generally over the years bipartisan support for the security of Israel. How is that evolving?
There is still a lot of bipartisan support for the security of Israel, and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have been very clear about that. And the Foreign Secretary himself speaks of himself. In fact, the Foreign Secretary speaks of himself as a liberal Zionist, and he says that in Parliament and on the record. So there is this sense of support for Israel as a state and for its security. But I think growing frustrations, particularly with the Netanyahu government, the sense that both Prime Minister Netanyahu and particularly the far-right members of his coalition have been dragging Israel into a particularly challenging place, and the situation on the ground in Gaza being really of deep concern. I think many of us will have seen those scenes. Some of them we know are somewhat staged, but there is genuine suffering and hunger in Gaza, and it's something that I think that there's a feeling needs to be addressed, and where gentle persuasion hasn't worked and speaking to the better angels of nature, there is this feeling in many countries, and of course France was the first to really push forward on this, and we've seen Canada follow since the UK took this action, that more needs to change, more needs to be put on the table in terms of trying to move the Israeli government into a new direction. So that's kind of the force of it. It's not that everyone and everywhere has abandoned Israel, not the UK government under Labour, and certainly not the Conservative opposition as it is now. But there is pretty deep concern with the way things are going.
The French-Saudi conference, sponsored conference that took place at the UN, in which the New York Declaration was issued, and it was in that context that, of course, statements from Prime Minister Starmer, among others. I wonder if it was at all surprising that the UK did not join early on in the declaration preparation and in the announcement of a conference in New York. Were you at all thinking that there might be the possibility that France and the UK together would join with Saudi Arabia, or has the UK sort of stepped back until quite recently on this rush toward unilateral declaration of statehood or recognition of statehood? Excuse me.
Yeah, well, the UK is a more recent joiner to this situation. France had put on a lot of pressure, particularly in recent weeks. The UK had, as I say, literally days before this announcement, been in a position of saying, this is not the right time. We want recognition to actually lead to progress towards a two-state solution. We don't believe now is the moment. And actually, the weekend beforehand, I'd written a piece in one of our national newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, saying the UK was right to be saying this, the UK government was right to be in this position. The Board of Deputies supports a two-state solution. That means they secure Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state. But we believe that that moment needs to have certain conditions. It can't come at a moment that rewards Hamas effectively for its terrorism, can't incentivize Palestinian Authority intransigence. They've been offered a state 5 times. They've said no each of those times. And it has to be something that leads to a Palestinian state in reality, not just in theory. Of course, we recognize there are serious challenges on the ground in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank. Israel also has to play its part towards moving in that direction, in our view as well. But, recognition out of nowhere unilaterally does not seem to us to be a good idea. And in this case, in the framing, has been pretty disastrous. As we've seen since that announcement, things have not gotten better, they've gotten worse. Hamas claimed that this was a vindication of their 7th October atrocities and the hostage taking. There seemed to be little pressure that's applied to them. They know, you rightly say that there's this kind of sense of, neither side will be able to veto it. Well, Hamas doesn't want to veto it. Hamas is quite happy for talks now to fail and for it to hold its ground, because effectively, if it gets to September and there's been no ceasefire because it keeps saying no, then they will be effectively rewarded with a state. That is a terrible incentive structure, and one that makes the UK and other allies less safe, because terrorist organizations say, well, we have a playbook. Commit an atrocity, keep it going, hide behind our own civilian population, and at a certain point, Western liberal countries will buckle, and this is a real problem.
Phil, thank you. I'd also be interested in your thoughts on the comments that were made by Foreign Secretary Lami over the weekend. He called the hostage videos that were released sickening. Just days before that, the Foreign Secretary was scorching in his assessment of Israel's response to Palestinian humanitarian needs, calling that situation grotesque and saying that he was, quote, appalled and sickened by reports of killings of those who were seeking aid in Gaza. How do you evaluate the Foreign Secretary's perspective on this complex and contentious situation? You've already described him, or maybe you reiterated, or you repeated his self-description as a liberal Zionist. How does it look to you today?
So he is clearly in those statements not saying anything that's particularly contradictory. He's holding two things at the same time: the absolutely appalling atrocities of 7th October and the disgraceful ongoing treatment of those hostages in Gaza. And we saw those heart-rending videos. It's just appalling what they're being made to go through, and their families are being made to go through as well. And at the same time, the very dire situation on the ground in Gaza, which is, of course, a real concern. So I don't think he's in principle wrong to be reflecting on both those things. And, David Lami is himself someone who knows the Jewish community very, very well indeed. His constituency is one of the most Jewish in the country. He, often speaks about how he got his start. I think he was the first Black British person to go to Harvard Law School. It might be Yale. I think it was Harvard Law School. And he was paid for by the Jewish partners in his law firm. And he said he's got a kind of an ongoing debt and relationship. And every year we have this highlight of the year where we have Hanukkah in his constituency with the Haredi community that live there. So, this is not someone who's unfamiliar to our community, but clearly, torn between these different things and leaning in a particular direction. And, I have a lot of respect for the fact that our political leaders are holding these two different truths in their head. But I think that actually, if they want to bring an end to this horrible crisis, they need to use their policy levers in a sensible way that incentivize the right kinds of decisions by all the actors, and not a situation where you incentivize the ongoing crisis. Because to the extent that this is a political management exercise, and we know that there's been this kind of uprising and upsurge of kind of discontent within the Labour Party and other places, the reason that people are angry, and I keep saying this to figures within the government, the reason people are angry is, only so much to do with a theoretical recognition or non-recognition of a Palestinian state. They're angry and upset because real people are suffering in a real war, and real hostages are in real tunnels. And actually, if you don't address those underlying concerns, the pressure on the UK government will continue to grow. So you need to use your policy levers to end that situation, and not accidentally continue to perpetuate it.
Very good, Phil. Thank you. Let's talk about what's happening within the British Jewish community. Of course, Jewish communities everywhere are torn by recent events, by the horrors of October 7th, 2023, by the long and painful war initiated Hamas, by the continuing torture of the hostages and their families. And of course, we were just talking about the horrific images over the weekend, by the mounting toll of civilian casualties, by the peril that Israel has faced on multiple fronts, and by the misinterpretation and one-sided condemnation of Israel and of Israel's supporters that we've also seen. So talk to us about how the British Jewish community has confronted these multiple challenges and tensions.
Well, thank you, Jason. The Board of Deputies, for your listeners and viewers, is a democratic organisation. So we're made up of 200 member organisations that are elect 300 deputies. I'm the deputy for my own local synagogue, and they meet as a sort of Jewish parliament, and it is the whole cross spectrum of Orthodox, progressive. Every section of our community is represented, and so we really see these tensions writ large. We meet every 6 weeks as a sort of parliament, and we hear those views expressed. And basically, and I imagine this is somewhat true of different diaspora communities, there are three main groups. One group is kind of what we might call Israel right or wrong. That's not to say that people don't have criticisms or might, agree with everything that Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing or saying, but they feel that to the extent we have criticisms, we should express them to the Israeli government privately. There's enough public criticism of Israel. Let's keep these things relatively private and make our criticisms, should we need to, behind the scenes. There's another group of people, in the main passionate Zionists, who say, no, Israel is in real trouble. The values of the state that we support as liberal Zionists are under threat. We need to be explicitly condemning the Israeli government right now. And there's a third group who are the kind of people who just want the shouting to stop, really. And they kind of, they're not really sure. They might have a series of contradictory or conflicting views. They're the people who at Seder night, when the liberal niece is arguing with the more conservative uncle, and they're going at it, and at some point this person will step in and say, would anyone like dessert? And they'll just try and pull it back and try and help the family to try and get on. And that's that. I spend a lot of time looking at that middle group, because that's the group that really, when it shifts, it really helps guide us. So we're really struggling with that. And kind of in response to that, last week we did something which I don't know if we've ever done before, which was we called a special meeting between meetings to specifically address this, because the tensions were really boiling up. And it was an opportunity for people from across the community to really express their views, their concerns, their hopes about the current situation. We came out following that with a statement that really affirmed four main values. First of all, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is a real concern, and it demands a Jewish response. We don't want to see people going hungry. We don't want to see civilians punished for the crimes of Hamas. Aid must get into Gaza, and Hamas must not steal that aid when it gets there. We need to see that situation working and making sure that aid gets to the people who need it. Of course, we need to see the hostages released. That's an absolutely essential aspect of this. We need to see Hamas prevented from ever being able to repeat the 7th of October. And we want to see lasting peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider Middle East. And those are the things that essentially, despite the great diversity of opinions that we have, that the Jewish community on the whole, and there'll be different emphases and different ways of getting to these places, support these objectives. And that's what we as an organization are seeking to get out and make the case about.
If I recall correctly, Phil, there was also an incident several months ago, maybe in April, where there were some members of the board who wanted a stronger position taken by the board. Can you talk to that and the reaction of the community to that insurgent movement within the board?
Yeah, so 36 of our deputies signed a letter to the Financial Times, one of our national papers, that really spoke to trying to push the Israeli government a lot harder, very explicitly condemning the Israeli government. Not very much in there about Hamas, I must say. And basically, it created a very polarizing reaction in the community. A lot of people said, what on earth are these people doing? The Israel right or wrong crowd were absolutely furious. They're going out and expressing themselves and condemning Israel at a time we don't need it. Quite a few other people sort of said, well, we need to hear this, these Jewish voices that are proudly Zionist in many ways, but actually critical of the Israeli government, and quite a lot of people who just didn't like the sound and the fury of it, and certainly not exposing this kind of disagreement to the public gaze. Our problem with it was slightly different. We don't have a problem per se with people expressing their opinions. The challenge with the statement was that it appeared to many people to be a statement from us. And
Wow.
so we've had to go through this whole disciplinary process that has initially found that the 36, to different levels and extents, because they had different roles within it, breached our code of conduct. That matter is currently under appeal. But, you know, we have to try and hold together a democratic institution, and that means clarity about who has the authoritative voice of the institution. It's okay if people speak in their own names, but leave us speaking in our own name to us. That's the message that we need to get across.
I can certainly appreciate that in a highly opinionated community. We all know something about this. What about those 36 people, though? I mean, are they satisfied with the position that you took last week as a result of your long internal consultation?
So the public response of a lot of them was that yes, they said that the board now is in a place that they can feel more comfortable with, and even if it's not everything that they feel, they feel that, you know, we're better reflecting the diversity of opinion. So that there is an element of that. Of course, you know, it's an ongoing challenge to see if we can try and bring the various tribes of Israel together and make sure that we can speak coherently. But like I say, I think the things that we are saying are a consensus perspective.
Indeed.
We as a Jewish community have these views and values, as I say, different ways of emphasizing them, but broadly we're on the same page on many of these things.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let me turn the subject to anti-Semitism. A report that was commissioned by the Board of Deputies and overseen by the government's advisor on anti-Semitism, Lord John Mann, whom we know very well, of course, and deeply respect, and former Defense Secretary Dame Penny Mordaunt, released last month, found, quoting from the BBC, if I may,
May
quote, not, I don't do that every day,
they may have gotten this one right.
Exactly. I mean, their quote was that the report found, quote, widespread failures to address anti-Jewish discrimination, including within the National Health Service, education and arts and policing, unquote. What actions have the British government or responsible non-governmental organizations in the UK taken to address this?
So this is incredibly important. When I stood for the role that I am, because mine is an elected voluntary role, this was one of my pledges to have a commission on anti-Semitism, because the world of anti-Semitism post 7th October, this is not just in the UK but everywhere, looks different, and we need to think about different tools to fight it. And over the last year, we've been particularly focused on the issue of public order. You'll have seen probably in the news these demonstrations. I know they exist in various forms in the States as well. And we've been very concerned about how close they've been to synagogues, some of the signs that have been there, some of the chants. So we've been working with the police and government to change that. And we've had notable successes. The police now move those demonstrations away from synagogue. We actually got the government to change the law to make that the established case that synagogues and other places of worship will be protected from these kinds of demonstrations where they pose a threat to freedom of religion and belief and to community life. And also, we've seen the prescription of a group called Palestine Action, which was daubing Jewish businesses and charities. It eventually had an incident where they kind of broke into a Royal Air Force military base and started spray painting over the planes, which was a really disastrous moment. So they've now been prescribed, which is something we called for. That there have to be limits in terms of that free speech. That you know, violent and criminal damage and with a purpose of causing fear should not be part of that legitimate debate and free speech. So we've moved that along. Where we've still got serious problems, and what this commission sought to address, was the problem in civil society. Because whether it's in the media, in social media, on university campuses, in the workplace, the National Health Service, trade unions, sport, culture, we've seen this rise in anti-Semitism. And like in many of these places, they have equality, diversity, inclusion practices, and that's very important. But too often it seems that Jews don't count. And this commission is our way of saying, well, Jews have to count. We're going to look at what's been going wrong in different areas and see how we can fix it. And it's come out with 10 recommendations that we're now pushing forward. In terms of the response, we've been pleased with the initial response. The government and opposition, who, by the way, had already endorsed the fact that we were doing this work, welcomed it. It was mentioned in Prime Minister's questions, and the Prime Minister said that the government would respond to it in full. I happened to see him at an event that evening. We spoke about it further, and we're going to be working with the government to try and bring forward the different changes we need to see. And we've already seen some tangible outcomes. So the same day that that came out, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, was addressing health leaders. He endorsed the report. He condemned to their faces the leaders of some of the institutions that were supposed to be protecting our community, but have been failing to do so. I know he subsequently hauled them in and is talking to them about the changes they need to be making. The Culture Secretary has instructed various parts of the arts infrastructure to meet with us and to see what we can do to change the dial. We had a very good meeting with the Arts Council, who are the major funding body for arts in this country, a very constructive conversation about how we promote Jewish artists and make sure that we don't see this cancellation that we've been seeing in various places, and we protect art as a free space where Jewish people can contribute, as we have done for centuries, to British public life. So that's all ongoing. It's been a good start. Obviously, it's the summer. We're now looking at the next stages of this, but we'll be picking it up with gusto as we go forward.
Phil, actually, I'm glad you raised the arts issue, because I wanted to focus on that a little bit as well. We read with dismay the news that the Royal Ballet and Opera has canceled plans to collaborate with the Israeli opera to stage Tosca next year in Tel Aviv. It's one of a number of such instances in the arts in Great Britain, but of course not only in Great Britain. How has the community responded, and how has the arts community responded? And have there been notable instances on the other side of support for Israel in the arts community?
So this has been an ongoing theme that we've seen in a number of places. Just a little while before that challenge, we saw a number of Jewish performers at the upcoming Edinburgh Festival who'd been performing there for many years, and who are not sort of explicitly all about Israel. They speak to their experience as British Jews. Found that their venues, who had for years had no problem hosting them, suddenly saying they were concerned about the security of their staff. And again, this is what we saw with the ballet. They sort of said it's not because of any political judgment, but we're concerned about the safety of our staff in Israel, and therefore we've decided to not go ahead with this one. And we're very concerned about that. I mean, we're very concerned about this as a kind of line. We saw it in universities as well, where universities would cancel Jewish or Israel-related events because they would say, well, we don't have the security. This is a closing down of the room for our community to live its life, with and it's letting the anti-Semites effectively win, and we can't have a society in which that happens. And I think the Arts Council, others seem to agree with that. We now need to look at how we begin to punch back. I'm glad to say the acts at the Edinburgh Festival have found new venues. And we're looking to find out how we punch back across the piece. But it is difficult. The arts is a liberal space, sometimes quite a radical space, and so there is a lot of broad sympathy for the Palestinian cause, and people are entitled to their opinions. But what we're seeing as a result is the shutting down of Jewish art and creativity. We've heard some really awful stories about Jewish performers whose klezmer bands, whose art is not in any way really linked to Israel at all, finding that venues that had been excited to host them suddenly find really spurious reasons to cancel them, and that's got to stop. Similarly, on the other side, we've seen expressions of support for the Palestinians go far, far too far. You'll have seen what happened at Glastonbury, where Bob Vylan, started chanting death to the IDF, but also spoke about the bald Zionist and really insulting language about a Jewish producer who he'd had contact with, who's clearly anti-Semitic in its framing. And this is not acceptable either. Now, there was quite a strong response to that. The police are investigating it. I know the United States revoked the visas of Bob Vylan to tour, which was, I think, a very helpful message. We've seen the government responded strongly, condemned it, and gave statements on it. So, we have seen a response to this sort of thing. It's not as if we're completely alone with it, but it is certainly a pervasive problem, one that we have to confront.
Were there also significant cultural figures who pushed back in the Glastonbury case?
There haven't been as many as we would like, to be honest. This is part of the challenge, that a lot of the cultural figures at the moment are on this sort of they're keen to sign these long joint letters condemning Israel and this, that, and the other way. And so there is more, publicly at least, more of a sense of people saying, oh, this is just free speech and people need to be able to have free speech. Well, actually, no. In all other cases of minority communities, you wouldn't accept this kind of treatment of a minority community. You wouldn't accept this kind of language, and rightly not. So in the same case with Jewish people, this is not liberal or progressive way of acting. Your views on the Israeli government and its policies are one thing, but actually your treatment of your fellow British performers is another. So we're working on a counterpunch. In fact, something we're doing, which is kind of following the American example, is for the first time next year, we're launching a Jewish Culture Month, a first British Jewish Culture Month, to kind of be an antidote to this. We want, instead of people pulling back, people to invest in Jewish cultural institutions. We've had good conversations with major broadcasters and major galleries and museums about what they can do to bring forward their collections of pieces by Jews or about Jews in the UK context. And we're going to really make a positive celebration. What we want to say is less oi, more joy. That's kind of what we're pursuing. It's originally coined by great American Deborah Lipstadt, and we are pursuing that with gusto. So we're really keen to change the narrative about us from being, about Jewish pain to Jewish joy.
Yeah, I watched a video of you using that phrase from Deborah as well. Phil, I have one more question, and then we'll open it up for those in the audience who wish to pose questions. How have the Jewish community's longtime coalition partners and friends in other ethnic and religious groups, in civil rights, social welfare, educational organizations responded to the attacks that we've seen on the community over the last year and a half? Has allyship been upheld in this very difficult period, as it has also suffered elsewhere in the world?
I think it's a similar picture. We have allies, and some of them have been really great at stepping forward. We have, people like Tom York at Radiohead. You asked about the arts. Has been really quite a positive response. We've seen that sort of thing happening, but not as much. It's been too muted. I think on the general principle of anti-Semitism, a lot of support in general, but sometimes more quiet than public, and we'd like it to be a bit more public than quiet. But in other cases, people are kind of, confide to me privately. I have Muslim friends who say, look, in practice, I am a Zionist. I believe Israel has a right to exist, but what's going on in Gaza is just terrible, and we need to see more from your community speaking out about it, and that's the challenge that they find. So we need to try and find ways to build bridges with the moderate middle in all communities. We need to really say that our allies do need to show up, and we need to try and work through this problem together. But like I say, when we released this commission on anti-Semitism, it was widely covered in the UK media. It was immediately raised in Parliament, and the Prime Minister himself backed it. So it's not as if we don't have friends. We know of people who are listening to the things that we're saying. They are. But, we've got to fight on our hands, as we do everywhere.
Indeed. Phil, thank you. Claire, let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jason. Our first question is from Maya Riggs, who's asking, has the Labour Party under Prime Minister Starmer done enough to distance itself from the Corbin era in the eyes of the Jewish community? And are those efforts holding up under the current pressures?
Maya, that's a great question. Keir Starmer deserves a lot of credit for the way that he handled the transition from the Jeremy Corbyn era and tackled anti-Semitism incredibly aggressively. I mean, I'm a member of the Labour Party, and I used to be a Labour councillor, and I experienced firsthand the horrors of that time, and I thought it would take a very, very long time to root it out. But actually, Keir Starmer, as leader of the opposition, really, really took this to his heart. He speaks about it frequently, how important it was to him. He spoke the other day when I saw him, he mentioned this as well. This is something that's really core that he had to deal with, and he sees as an ongoing mission. But I think the Jewish community has been, very disappointed with the stance on foreign policy. It's a slightly different thing, but for many of us, that's such an important part of our identity as Jewish people. Even the first weeks, some of the reversals of policy that really seem to target Israel, and obviously the announcement last week have created a lot of anger in the Jewish community about where Keir Starmer is, and he's in a difficult position because I've got to be honest, the Muslim community doesn't think he's in the right place either. I joke to Muslim dialogue partners that if we can all agree on one thing, it's that we feel let down by Labour on the Middle East. Because for them, this idea that there's recognition, but it's conditional, is an outrage. So, he's kind of find it hard to find friends on this issue. But, I think that the Labour Party itself is a very different kind of animal. But of course, this whole situation is is a real challenge, and it's meant that the Jewish community is feeling increasingly a cold house about it. And I've got to say, and I spend a bit of time with the Labour leadership in various ways, I don't think this is what they want to be doing, in the sense that this is not, to Jeremy Corbyn, this issue was absolutely core to his being. This was the thing that really got him out of bed in the morning. For the Labour Party now, they really want to be talking about growth, rebalancing their international partnerships with America and Europe. The war in Ukraine is very important. Fixing our national health service. These sorts of things are the things that Labour really wants to be focused on. But at the moment, the issues in the Middle East just dominate and particularly affect community relations here. And they can't even get onto the things that they want to get onto. So I think there's a great sense of frustration. It's not where they want to be, but they kind of feel forced to be engaging with this. And the Israeli government is not a center-left government. Let's say it's a government of the right, and there is a natural challenge in terms of the relationship there, a lack of understanding perhaps, but that's particularly exacerbated at this moment. So we've got a challenge on our hand of a government that I think wants to be friendly, but is finding it hard to be so in the context, and that's the kind of bridge we need to build.
No, thank you for that. We noticed that Jeremy Corbyn has not faded away. What is his current political status and reach?
So he's in the process of creating a new party, and the thing about Jeremy Corbyn is, whatever you think about his views, his politics is also often handled rather shambolically. So the party is currently called Your Party, which everyone thinks is a joke name, and they're currently working on a consultation about how to change the name. And it's a very strange kind of group of people who are generally speaking on the far left, and kind of in what has become, and it was a new feature of the last general election, this Gaza Independence Party, people whose politics was principally framed around Gaza and who won a few seats in the general election, sometimes overturning substantial historic Labour majorities. So it is of concern. It remains to be seen whether the party will get off the ground. Some polls suggest it will do quite well. Others suggest, well, it will do okay, but it's going to take votes principally off the other party that's to the left, the Green Party, rather than the established Labour base. And other things that say, well, it's so disorganised and incoherent and badly managed that it's probably unlikely to go anywhere at all. But we are in a time of increasing political diversity. There is the Reform UK Party, which is to the right of the Conservatives, who made a breakthrough and are actually polling now top in consistently in British polls, ahead of Labour and ahead of the Conservatives, the party led by Nigel Farage. So there is this kind of sense that there's a real possibility of a massive realignment of British politics, rather than the traditional 2 and sometimes 3-party politics, vast multi-party politics. And we're as a society not really ready for that yet. What will happen, we see in Germany that's more common, multi-party coalitions. Here we're talking about people with very vastly different ideologies. And the UK system, quite like the American system, has been pretty stable. You get a government, you're more or less aware of the direction it's headed. Here, the competing challenges of coalition politics and the possibility that one of these insurgent right-wing or left-wing populist parties might come to dominate is a real concern. And that's also on the minds of the Prime Minister and indeed the main opposition, the Conservatives, at the moment politically.
Understood. No, thank you for that, Phil. Claire, any other questions?
Yes, our next question is from Candy Gold, who's asking, do you think there's a chance the UK will go ahead with the declaration of the State of Palestine before the UNGA, or is there any possibility that they'll pull back from their statement?
So the UK government has, as we said at the beginning, expressed conditions about it, and one assumes that if those conditions are met, then it won't. But those conditions seem pretty unlikely, because they are conditions which not only are difficult for Israel to achieve even if it wants to, but also, certainly alone, but also because it goes against the core tenets of the coalition in Israel's policy, whether one likes that or not. The government of Israel at the moment, indeed, actually even the opposition parties, are not in the space of kind of trying to advance at a pace towards a 2-state solution. You hear that really across the piece. So it seems unlikely that Israel will be able to meet the conditions, and therefore it seems most likely that their recognition will go ahead. But, I think the UK has given itself some wiggle room, that if things happen that are surprising or, cause a rethink, then then they may do. And we're certainly trying hard. We've got a march and a rally outside the Prime Minister's residence this coming weekend to say that there must be a condition on the hostages being released. We think that will, a lot of people will have a problem with recognition of Palestine at the moment for all sorts of reasons, but at least if you put in that condition, it changes the game so that Hamas will realize that if it doesn't get recognition, it will be held responsible, and therefore it might be more likely to release those hostages, might be more likely to agree a ceasefire. At the moment, as I said, the incentives are all in the wrong place. So we continue to keep that argument going, and we will hope to try and push that forward as we go. But at the moment, it looks like the UK, France and Canada are on course to make that recognition in September, which is concerning, as I say, because of the incentives that it gives.
Thank you, Phil. Claire, other questions?
Yes, many people are actually asking about the situation on university campuses for British Jews. Will this potential policy change impact them? What has it been like? And what has it been like since October 7th?
It's been difficult, and I think quite similar to the States. I mean, there's been all sorts of challenges. Universities are often places where people explore more radical views, and that's been challenging. I think that over the last year, universities have gotten better at dealing with it. The hobby of encampments, which began, I think, in the States and was quickly imported here, a lot of universities have been taking a tougher line on that, using the legal tools available to them to clear those off, which I think is really important, and we've seen that happen. But it's an ongoing challenge. In a lot of universities, there are problematic resolutions coming forward, and university leaderships are dealing with it in better and worse ways. And the issue kind of ebbs and flows. I mean, there have been times where people said that at certain points where those protests had been very vast in number, they reduced quite drastically in the second year of this conflict. But who knows where they'll be in the new year, in the new academic year that begins. So the short answer is it's of concern. Some things have been lessons learned, and universities are dealing with some things better, but it is an ongoing challenge. My friend and colleague, who's the president of our Union of Jewish Students, which is a fantastic representative organization for our students, 9,000-ish Jewish students that they represent, says that there are more people attending Jewish events on campus than ever. So that's quite good news. People have come together in greater numbers, but under more security than ever before. And so you've got this kind of situation where people in many ways are living their Judaism more proudly, more loudly, but with more protection. We want that loud and proud to continue, but we'd like the need not to have that protection. We want people to have a good time. So people are having a good time, but there are unfortunately some of the challenges that we've just got to be realistic and mindful about.
Let me just jump in for a second on the issue of protection and ask to what degree the British government or municipalities, the London municipality, for instance, is providing sufficient protection at Jewish institutions. Is there a police presence in synagogues and Jewish day schools and things like that?
There is, and it's government provided, which is really an amazing thing. The government has given grants, and they've been year on year growing grants to protect places of worship, synagogues, schools, other Jewish buildings, and that's been really a cross-party consensus, and you've seen that under both, as I say, the Conservative and Labour parties, and it's something that is very much appreciated by our community, because the costs of doing business in the Jewish world, unfortunately, have been long related to security, and everything we do and we take for granted has been under security protection. And I must say, our hearts completely went out to the AJC on the horrific attacks that you saw against your own event. And we as Jewish people shouldn't live in that fear. We have in this country for a long time, though, had that necessity. I know in America, particularly since the Tree of Life attack in Pittsburgh, there's been a change of view on this, that buildings, there's more of an investment in security, and perhaps the federal government and others can here maybe learn something from the UK's. Unfortunately, we've had to develop these infrastructures, mechanisms, funding streams that support Jewish life through that security grant. So yeah, on that front, you've got to give credit to the government and past governments too.
Very good. And as you know, of course, we continue to do what we can to encourage greater investment by the government at every level in security for our community. Claire, I think there are maybe a few more questions.
Yes. Saul Greenberg is asking about the British media. How have they impacted the conversation, and were they fueling the fire for this policy change?
I think we've been very disappointed at the way that the media has handled this. I've had two meetings with the Director General of the BBC where I complained both about the content and the culture of the corporation. We think that there's been significant bias in their coverage for much of this conflict. And we think that the culture of the institution has at times been rotten. We've heard from Jewish staff at the BBC how isolated and marginalized they felt at times in their workplace, which is really unacceptable. And it's an ongoing challenge. I've got to be honest with you. It's you see progress. You know, we called for the sacking of Gary Lineker after he shared a video. He was their most highly paid presenter, sports presenter, soccer show presenter, and he shared an emoji of a rat when describing Israel and the Jewish people, and that was just unacceptable. And I think the BBC even had to say, yeah, that he's got to go for that. So you see progress like that. The BBC committed to have an independent thematic review of its output since 7th October. They promised us that latest this would begin by June this year. It hasn't yet begun, I'm afraid to say, so we've got to continue on their case. This week we did see some positive movement in the sense that, well, we started from a bad place in that after those horrific images of the hostages, we said, well, where are those images? And actually, to be fair, the BBC did make that the top story. They've had some very good pieces in recent days on things like the payment system that Hamas uses, how it funds its economy. It's quite an interesting piece worth having a look at. So, you know, it's ongoing work. Speaking to the BBC, I must say, it's a bit like nailing jelly to a wall. One of the conversations I had with them, and it's, you know, this is just how it is. I sort of said to them, look, to build confidence, we're going to tell you what we're going to say in our statement following this meeting, and we're going to set out the 5 things that we've asked of you. And the first response was, but if you do that, we'll be held to account on that. And we're like, yes, that's the point. So, you know, the BBC is work in progress. It's a real challenge. And we do think it has kind of fired some of the heightened tensions that we've seen, but it's got to be work in progress. I've got to say at the same time, as much as that's all true, it is an increasing problem that Israel won't let the media into Gaza. And, you know, we understand the challenges that would entail in terms of the operation of the media there and in a war zone, as it always is a challenge. But, you know, you got to ask, could the media coverage be worse if they were there? I mean, so at the moment, you've got the situation where they're very reliant on output that is almost always controlled by Hamas. At least if they were in, they could question, interrogate, verify more easily. And we think it would probably tell Israel's story better. At this stage, it's been slow progress in that direction. We think probably that should change.
Indeed. Thanks, Phil. Claire?
Yes. Mickey Krakauer is wondering, and others are wondering, is there any traction with changing the narrative about Palestinian suffering and making sure it's clear where Hamas is responsible? What messages are resonating with the British public?
So it's really interesting. So I spoke about the statement we made last week, and I've been on the BBC and other channels to discuss that change in tone rather than change in policy, I'd say. And I've got to tell you something really interesting happened. We got a lot of feedback in a way that we don't usually, from random members of the British public saying, thank you for that. That was really helpful. That was really, I really feel, you know, exactly what you say is how I feel. And it's a steer to me. And I think this is really important, that what we don't get enough of in the pro-Israel cause, if you like, is empathy. And there is a lot of people who seem to think that if you show empathy to the Palestinians, and you know, in every war, people suffer, and in this war, you know, people in Gaza are no exception. That if you show empathy, that somehow weakens your argument. It doesn't, in fact. People, if they hear you saying, you know, you express sympathy with the Palestinians who are genuinely suffering and calling for better treatment, Israel to get that aid in, of course, Hamas not stealing it, but making sure that aid gets there, then those same people are more able to hear you speaking about the evil of Hamas or the need, the pressing need to get the hostages out. They don't switch off and just say, this person is just a kind of mindless advocate. They see that you're a full person that can hold these two truths at the same time. So that is, for me, an interesting message about resonance. And I think too rarely do we see Israel's advocates, either officially from the government or elsewhere, being able to make that acknowledgement. And I think actually empathy goes a long way. So my advice is try empathy.
Yeah, look, we've observed that lesson as well. Thank you, Phil. Claire, I think is there anything else that our audience would like to say at this point?
Yes, one more from Jenna Lorton. Is there concern within the UK Jewish community that this shift in policy may embolden more aggressive anti-Israel or anti-Semitic rhetoric in public life?
So there are people who are concerned about that, and there's a lot of talk now about ambient anti-Semitism and this just sense of greater hostility, and some people think that there's a link. There's no direct causal link on the figures that we have. We have a brilliant organization, the Community Security Trust, that does the monitoring of anti-Semitism for us. They just released their latest figures yesterday, or I think it was the day before, or yesterday, about the state of anti-Semitism in the UK. They cannot prove a causal link between statements of the government and rise in anti-Semitism, but it's quite hard to tell, because clearly there are sometimes trigger incidents that do drive a rise in anti-Semitism. It's important to say that the sharpest rise in anti-Semitism that we saw in the UK was actually after the 7th of October itself, before Israel went into Gaza. So there is something in the culture of anti-Semitism which is excited by not just the sense that Israel is too strong, but the sense that Israel is weak, and that seems to excite some parts of the anti-Semitic group. But there's no doubt that when things are getting worse on the ground, that sort of drives discourse, and that's a problem. So, you know, of course, we call on our politicians to be responsible in the way they speak about things, but we also want to see this conflict wrapped up. We want to see the hostages out. We want to see aid in. We want to see Hamas prevented from ever repeating the horrors of 7th October. And we want to see progress towards lasting peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider Middle East. It's an urgent task. I know, you know, the United States is in a very important position, and you at the AJC, I know, are leading on the charge to get us into a better place on this as well, and I thank you for it. But this is where we have to try and get to, because I think this will help us all a great deal.
I think we feel really precisely the same way, Phil. Thank you very much for that, and thanks for really enlightening us on the situation of the community and how you see the impact of the government's recent decisions. And of course, we'll be looking forward to whatever developments we can hope for, and as the government maybe we can hope rethinks the position that it took last week, but we will respond appropriately to that and other governments that have taken the same decisions in light of the statements that were made last week in New York. Phil Rosenberg, thank you for joining us in AJC Advocacy Anywhere, and let me turn it back to you, Claire.
Thank you both for sharing your expertise on today's AJC Advocacy Anywhere program, and thank you to our global audience for tuning in today. To stay up to date on the latest developments around this and AJC's global advocacy work, make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. Thank you again, and goodbye.